Good evening, everyone, and welcome to one of our most important panels during our annual meeting. We're so privileged to have distinguished representatives here from the US Senate, the House of Representatives, and two governors. And hopefully, after this discussion, we will understand more about the US politics, and the role of the United States of America in the world. And America really matters. 25% of the global GDP comes from the US, and 5% of the global population. So this country has done pretty well. And is still doing well if you look at the economic outlooks, also that the World Economic Forum produces. We are pretty bullish on the US. There is a lot of innovation, there is still a lot of growth, and if there is a recession, we don't predict that, but if there is one, I think it's going to be shallow. But also 45% of the global military capacity is still with the US. So if the US decides to take side, the US decides to get involved, it really, really matters. So in Europe, we have always thought about the US as an exporter of predictability, growth, values, and principles. And I think a lot of the world still is of that view, but we know that there is also not always that there is agreements in Washington, D.C. And that's also in any democracy. There is disagreements, but I think the feeling has been lately that there has been a lot of partisanship in the US. So we wonder how can things get done on behalf of the Americans too. One thing is to take responsibility for the world, but it's also very important to get things passed, I guess, both in the House and in the Senate to also make things happening. And this is also means a lot for the states. So let me start with you, Senator Coons, here on my left side. There was a lot of legislation that was done in the fall. We heard also President Ursula von der Leyen today address the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of infrastructure investments, a lot of investments also in decarbonization. Do you expect now, with a Republican majority in the House, a Democratic majority in the Senate, that there will be new legislation and new things happening in the next 2 years, or is it now only going to be about the next presidential campaign?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for the question and for the recognition that even in a 50-50 closely divided Senate, even in a period of great partisanship, that in the last 2 years in the House and Senate with Democrats and Republicans working together, we passed landmark legislation to help fund and modernize our infrastructure, to help deal with unmet needs for our veterans, to help with chips and science, investment in manufacturing and in reshoring, and many other bills. A remarkable array of legislation in just 2 years. Your question is, now that we have divided government in Congress between the House and the Senate, will we get anything done? We have to. The American people expect it. It will be a little more challenging. There will be some big issues, the debt ceiling, for example, where we may struggle. But if you look at the rest of the world, we recognize, those of us who serve as governors of states, as members of the House and Senate, we recognize that while we have divisions and differences, at the end of the day, we have a responsibility, as you put it, to continue being an exporter of values and stability. I do think we'll find broad agreement about the importance of strengthening our alliances, competing effectively with China, and supporting Ukraine in its ongoing war against Russian aggression. There's many other things we can discuss, but I thought I'd start on a positive note by highlighting a few things where I think there's some agreement.
And I think there's a lot of questions here on Ukraine. Will there be continued support also in the coming year on Ukraine from the US?
I believe there will. At the end of last year, we passed, both chambers and sent to the president, legislation that provided another $45 billion in support, humanitarian, economic, and military. And Ukrainians are being trained in the United States at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, on the Patriot system that President Biden has now approved transferring to Ukraine. The brutality of the war in Ukraine, the violence of it, its very imperial nature, has not just brought together our allies around the world, but mobilized Americans. There is, I think, a reasonable expectation that that spending will be accountable, that there will be transparency about it. But I think there's other things that we are going to have to tackle, gun violence, refugees and immigration and the border. There's a number of members here who've been active in bipartisan solutions to those challenges as well.
And I know Senator Manchin and Sinema has also collaborated on the IRA and other initiatives. But first, to you, Senator Manchin, we all watched the speech of President Zelensky that addressed the both of the chambers. Do you think that changed anything in the Congress? Do you think it changed things in America, that speech?
I think it solidified an awful lot of the support that we've already had. It helped an awful lot for him to come and recognize all that the American people have done in support in Ukraine. The commitment that we have is unending. We're going to stay with Ukraine until they are victorious. I think that's not only for Ukraine, but for the entire world. It's important, especially the EU. So we're very much committed to that. And the energy it's going to take, basically, Putin usually weaponized energy. So with Putin weaponizing energy, the United States has to step to the plate. And we have to backfill with LNG and all different things we can to help our allies. That was the whole purpose of the IRA bill that we have in America. That bill was passed basically on energy security. I know it's been touted as an environmental bill, but I think we're all responsible to decarbonize. But you don't eliminate, you just don't eliminate what the world is using. You use it and innovate it, and you do it better. That's what we're trying to do, and all of us work together on that. And I think it's going to be a very, very monumental bill that's going to endure for quite some time. And hopefully that we can be able to be in a stronger, more independent and secured. The United States cannot be the greatest economy in the world, and we cannot be the superpower of the world if we don't have energy security. Energy independence and security maintains that. And we have to depend, look around the world for someone to do what we don't want to do for ourselves. And we have all the resources to do everything that we can and do it better. I think it's a shame we didn't. So the IRA gives us that pathway forward. But Ukraine, I don't know, I've never seen support more solid. You hear a few people on both sides maybe questioning, should we continue down this large, I think we're in $100 billion or more right now in support. But I can tell you, my vote will always be to support Ukraine until they are victorious.
Thank you. I was also wondering, Senator, what do you think will be the biggest topics for the Senate and for the House in the two coming years?
You have to look, I mean, we all know, and I think that Senator Sinema, Senator Coons, everybody, if we had immigration, the United States, we have to have a strong, robust employment, but you have to have legal immigration. You cannot have an immigration discussion unless you have border security. And unless you're committed to border security, we're not going to get that done. So if that's going to be don't waste any time. If we have to do permitting, we can't meet the goals that we need to be energy independent unless we can get the job done. And you can't get the job done in the United States if it takes 5, 7, and 10 years to permit something that takes 2 and 3 years, even in Europe. So we've got to change that. We think there's some deals to be made from the standpoint. The main thing about negotiation is you can't get everything you want. You know, you can try to improve it. Now, if you're improving it, do you take that as a win and move on to the next? Or do you say it wasn't good enough? So you let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That's not who we are.
Senator Sinema, you're from Arizona. I guess immigration is a big thing in Arizona?
It is, and unfortunately, Arizonans have suffered from the last 40 years of the federal government's failure to address this crisis, which is why this is something that I've been spending so much time and energy working on this. Folks in our participating in this panel tonight might know that in the winter, just before the Christmas holidays, Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina and I put out a immigration framework that both addresses security issues around creating a secure border so we can deter individuals who want to bring dangerous drugs and criminals into the country, which, by the way, that's happening on a nearly unimpeded basis right now because we do not have the personnel, we're not utilizing the technology to effectively stop this type of crisis of drugs and dangerous individuals entering our country. But we also need to reform the asylum system. Right now, we have an asylum system that actually creates a pull factor for criminal cartels in South America to bring individuals to this country, to our country, who have no legal basis for a permanent path to citizenship. So we want to combine that with also making changes to our system to create a path to citizenship for dreamers, to ending the visa backlog so that we can actually hire the talent we need at all edges and across the entirety of the spectrum. So Senator Tillis and I proposed this framework right before the Christmas holidays. As most folks are aware, we ran out of time to push that legislation through because of the budget process. However, we came back in early January, and just last week, Senator John Cornyn of Texas, a border senator, and myself led a delegation of 4 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and myself, an independent, to the border in both Texas and Arizona. We began talking about our framework, and we are building the bipartisan coalition that we believe will allow us to pass legislation through both the House and the Senate this year.
Thank you. One thing I was reflecting on is that a strength for the U.S., if you compare the demography between the U.S. and, for example, China, where you see labor force is going down for the first time. While in the U.S., the demography is still quite favorable. So by 2050, America still will be as young as today. But it is also changing, and we know there's lack of labor. So how do you think about this? The U.S. was the land of opportunities. Most of you have very diverse backgrounds. When you also need people in the years to come, will you then let people in, and on what premises if you're stopping Know Your Borders?
So the key is to create a system where we get to choose as a nation who we will invite into the country and who we will not. Right now, because our immigration security system is completely broken, we're not choosing who gets to come and who doesn't. The cartels are choosing, and that is not sustainable for our country. So in order for us to have a system where we are bringing the best and the brightest, whether it be farm workers or J-1 visas for doctors, or whether it be geniuses who can help us create the new ideas for the future, we need to be in control of that. And that means reforming the system so that we can actually identify what jobs we need filled and then choose who are the kinds of folks we want to come to our country, while also making sure that we're keeping out criminal elements and the dangerous drugs that have created an ever-increasing and concerning fentanyl crisis. I expect our governors could talk more about this fentanyl crisis than anyone else on this panel because they're suffering through it every single day.
Thank you. Turning to you, Congresswoman Maria Salazar, Florida, a couple of questions. First, on Ukraine. Do you confirm the same as Senator Manchin and also Coons said? Do you think there will be the same support also from the new House as it has been in the past?
I think thank you, and thanks once again for inviting us to this panel. I do believe that there's heavy discussion within the GOP for what you are saying, specifically among the Republican members of Congress. But I'm one of those. I am Cuban-American, first generation, so we know what the Soviets and the Russians can do to you. I'm very good friends with Victoria Sparks, who is the Ukrainian-American sole representative Republican of the Ukraine people on the floor. And I do believe that regardless of any discussion or doubts of the $100 billion that we have donated or given to the Ukrainians to defend themselves, we will at the end vote, at least my vote is secured, to continue with the Ukrainians until they win. The United States saved Europe, and I'm very aware that the Ukraine, the situation is very important for this part of the world because we are here in Switzerland, and it puts things into perspective that for the Europeans, this is a very important issue. For the United States, it's an issue that we're going to repeat the same thing. We're going to liberate Europe, quote unquote, in 2023, just like we did in 1945. We understand that that is our duty, although there is some doubts in some members of the GOP on the House if we should continue, because we have so many issues that we need to pay attention to at home, and one of them is immigration. So I just wanted to use this opportunity that I would love to work with Senator Sinema and with the other senators on the House, because I agree that immigration is one of the major problems that we are facing on our shores. There's no way that the United States can continue being what it is, the most important power in the world, the #1 economy in the world, if we don't have hands. And I represent the Hispanics, which are the largest minority in the country. We're 23%, and the overwhelming majority of the people who are crossing the border as we speak are Hispanics, Latinos like I am. And this nation, and I believe that people like me in Congress should be the ones telling the rest of the political elite that it's time for both parties to pay attention to something that for the last 35 years, either party has been able to do, which is to pass complete overhaul of the immigration system. Because not only we need those hands, like a senator was saying, but we need to also give dignity to those people who are in the country. And those are the people that I represent. We're talking about 13, 15 million people who are, most of them Hispanics, I would say 85%, who speak my language, look like me, and sound like me, that are contributing with the economy of this country, and they live in the shadows. So it's time to seal the border, like she said, put order, let's see who comes in and who doesn't, and then turn around and give dignity. That doesn't mean path to citizenship. That means to include them and make them dignified members of our community.
Thank you. Just a short question on this seal the borders.
Yes.
Since you also have a Cuban background. If there are Cubans then fleeing from Cuba, shouldn't the U.S. receive them if they're fleeing from also political persecution and all this? And in a system where you should pick and choose, where does this with political, difficulties? You know, all the Jews that came to America and seeked also protection in the run-up to the Second World War. You received them all, and I think it's gone pretty well.
Yes.
I represent the city of Miami, the heart of the Cuban exile community. So that is the question that we face every day. The United States laws say that you have to go through due process. And not only the Cubans, but the Venezuelans and the Nicaraguans are confronting the same thing that the Ukrainians are, socialism and communism. And I do believe that we have to give due process of law to those people who are running those tyrannies and incorporate them and accept them into the country if they do face persecution.
Thank you. A short comment from Senator Coons, and then I go to Congress.
Just about our history. Shamefully, we did not welcome all the Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. In fact, there's a famous incident, a case of the SS St. Louis that sailed up and down the east coast of the United States, being rejected over and over, and ultimately most of those passengers were forced back to Germany, and many of them perished. And it was because of that experience that the United States helped lead the development and ratification of a global treaty that says we have an obligation to allow those who are seeking asylum. So I just want to say to my friends and colleagues, the senator and the congresswoman, we have a balance we need to strike between having a secure border and being a nation to which people come to seek dignity and redemption, a chance at freedom, and getting that balance right, where we have a humane system that allows for asylum, but that is also legal and regular and orderly. That's a tough balance, but with leadership such as they've shown, I'm hopeful that we can achieve that.
Right.
So, thank you. I'm going to go to the two congresswomen, and then we're going to go to also the governors, where the real stuff is happening. We'll just have to go the round in D.C. First. I just wanted a short question to you, Congresswoman Salazar, before moving to Congresswoman Sherrill. We know that it took a little bit of time before, David, you chose the new Speaker of the House. So a couple of days or whatever. What has that led to in the caucus, the GOP caucus? Has it changed anything? Is something broken? Do you think this can be reconciled? Do you think this will lead to a different GOP in the House in the 2 years to come?
Listen, it was 3 days. We were very tired, very frustrated, but I can say to you at the end that democracy worked. Democracy is messy. It's not always pretty. It's frustrating. Hey, during the founding father years, Madison was fighting with Lincoln, and not with Lincoln, with during that creating the Constitution, things
it's a few years ago.
Yeah, like 250 years ago.
Still
plus.
slavery around.
Sure, but the founding fathers just didn't like each other that much. But look what the nation they created and the Constitution they put together. So we're still experiencing, and I was there, so I want to share with you an anecdote. You can still see the American exceptionality coming up and flourishing. The Republican Party under Kevin McCarthy is a new one, because what he proved during those 3 very torturous days is that every faction within the GOP on the floor of the United States Congress is going to be heard, including the freedom, the most radicals, the most conservatives, including the moderates and the ones who are in the middle. So everyone on the GOP is going to be heard. And we've had many conversations after those 3 torturous days that proves that we are going to be able to work in a bipartisan fashion. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be one of those voices.
Yeah. No, I think we don't envy Kevin McCarthy to keep that group together. I think that's going to be challenging. But turning to you, Congresswoman Sherrill, you saw what was unfolding for those 3 days, and I started to ask Senator Coons how he sees the possibility to get things done, both in the House and in the Senate in the 2 years to come. Do you think that process will have a lot of impact on the environment for getting things done in the House?
Well, I think what we saw was there are really 2 ways this could go. And one is somewhat dire for the country, and one is really hopeful. And by that I mean what we've seen over the past several Congresses, and this is not new, is a reluctance for a speaker to work with members from the other political party. So what I would have loved to have seen in this event, instead of reaching out to the very extreme members of the far right, if Kevin McCarthy wanted to strike a deal with the moderate members of the Democratic Party. That's not something he did. It's not something, quite frankly, Speaker Pelosi was wont to do, reach across the aisle. And I think as we've seen the nation pushing us ever more towards moderation and towards bipartisanship with these tight groups of people. I mean, the Senate was 50-50 in the last cycle. We had a very slim majority for Democrats, now a very slim majority for Republicans. The nation's pushing us towards moderation, and yet when you don't have speakers reaching across the aisle, you have them beholden to the extremes of the party, which is, I think, bad for the country and bad for the moderate center. So if McCarthy chooses to continue moving forward with these extremists, I'm very concerned about the debt ceiling and what that might mean for our ability to raise it. However, I think there will be opportunities for all of us in the House to work together to make sure that the must-pass legislation gets passed. And I think that could be really good for Congress and really good for the country.
No, thank you very much. I'm turning then to Governor Kemp of Georgia. We know you well. We've seen you a lot on TV all over the world. During the last elections, you were very clear on some principles. You were re-elected, a broad majority. Now, of course, there has been some reflections why the Republicans didn't do better in the House election with representatives. And a lot of the candidates that were election deniers were not elected. Any reflections on that because of your own background too? Because you came under some pressure, but you didn't really give in on that, did you?
Well, I mean, look, I wouldn't want to try to speculate on, every member, every Republican candidate for Congress or the United States Senate outside what we saw in Georgia. My own perspective is I think the people of the state that I represent, which is a great one, they want us to know, they want to know the differences between the candidates, but they also want to know what we're for. Like, what are they going to get the next 4 years? And that's something that we just stayed focused on. And I think when you look at the Republican ticket in the state of Georgia, we've had 2 record years in a row economically. Our mid-year numbers will probably break last year's numbers if you take out the 2 big mega projects we had. We talked about the things that we did on teacher pay raises, on school security, our 2 healthcare waivers, even though a lot of the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. was trying to hold those up. We had innovative solutions that are lowering private sector costs and bringing more access to people, really pushing back to the one-size-fits-all narrative that my opponent's been driving for literally 6 years now. And I think people bought into that. They bought into a politician that, and I got this question at the end of the campaign. A reporter said, "What's your closing message to people?" And I asked the question to the voters, look at the candidates and ask who's been fighting for you? Who was fighting to keep your business open when all the pressure from both political parties, from people in high places, from a lot of other people that were sitting in their basement on a computer was not to stay open, it was not to reopen our economy? Who was pushing to get our kids back in the classroom? Well, we did all of those things. And, we proved that we were fighting for people. We were fighting for election security. We were fighting for people to have a good paying job and to have, to survive, to fight another day economically in our state. We fought for our people by giving them $1 billion of their tax money back to help them fight through 40-year high inflation because, in my opinion, of a lot of bad policies in Washington, D.C., and the voters of my state, the great state of Georgia, certainly responded to that.
Thank you, Governor. How does it look seeing it from the capital, your capital, and looking at D.C.? There's a lot of partisanship, and of course there will be disagreements in a democracy, but do you think it has gone so far that it can be a negative factor for America now moving forward?
Well, listen, I think from my perspective, a lot of frustration with Washington, D.C. I understand, Senator Coons' position on the IRA, but, that hurt Georgia-based electric vehicle companies in our state. It was not treating them fairly. I believe the legislation picked winners and losers. Thankfully, I think the administration is working on fixing that. I don't think we were treated fairly in a state because we had been open. We had a low unemployment rate, so the level of funding coming out of Washington, D.C. and the current administration, we were treated differently from New York and California. Their citizens per capita were getting more money than ours, and so that's frustrating to someone like me as a governor that just wants to have our citizens treated fairly. There's frustrations, quite honestly. Look, if there's gridlock in Washington, D.C., one thing you can count on is the stability and a great economy, a great business environment in the state of Georgia, and we're going to keep rocking and rolling. But it is frustrating to have to deal with the fentanyl crisis because we simply cannot secure our border in this country. And I'm hopeful that something gets done, but, my advice, take it for what it's worth. While we're waiting on that, just secure the border. I mean, literally every governor in the country is dealing with the fentanyl crisis. We're dealing with street gang crisis. We're dealing with human trafficking crisis. And those are the issues that we're trying to tackle at the state level. But I believe much could be solved. And I think there will be broad bipartisan support for simply, in the meantime, while you're working on these things, to secure the dang border.
Thank you, Governor. Moving to Illinois, Governor Pritzker, also re-elected, second term, increased your majority, also overall. And we know that you also, for this re-election, you were out there saying that Illinois should be 100% based on net zero or renewables by 2050. Was that something that was well received during your campaign?
Extremely well received. And in fact, we passed a Climate and Equitable Jobs Act for the state of Illinois, which is significantly increasing our focus on clean energy. We're actually going to be fossil-free by 2050 in the state of Illinois. So we are making significant progress. And I think in that vein, I want to disagree with Democrats and Republicans across this panel on something. There was a lot of talk about the desire for bipartisanship. I think that certainly if you ask the public, do you think that Congress or that states should work in a bipartisan fashion? The answer is yes. But what they really mean, in my view, is they want to get things done. And let me say about the current president of the United States, he has gotten things done. Now, he has worked with some reluctant members of his own party. He's worked with some reluctant members of the opposite party, but we have gotten things done for the United States at the federal level under this president. But the truth is, not enough, not enough. And so at the state level—
What are you missing?
Well, I think at the state level, and I think the governor would agree with me that, look, the people of our states want us to increase jobs, grow the economy, make sure that in my state, people want to ban assault weapons. We just did that. Protect a woman's right to choose. We just did that. Those are not happening at the federal level and should. But we're doing it at the state level, and it's true also about building our economy. We just passed $1 trillion GDP for the state of Illinois. We're the 5th state in the country to do that, but we're doing that with some help from the federal government. But frankly, we've had to chart a course and set an industrial policy, essentially, for our state. How are we attracting business? I think the same is true for Georgia. We compete with Georgia on some, important industries. The film industry, you're doing very well. We're coming up behind you in the film industry, and we'll be exceeding you soon. But
Respectfully disagree.
But the point is that I think people want to get things done, and especially for working families, for creating jobs, yes, so businesses benefit, but also just lifting up middle-class families and working-class families and people who rely on government. And that's something that, again, I think at the federal level for the last 2 years, a lot has gotten done. Getting past the pandemic is a major, talk about, saving the economy and saving lives. We did that at the federal level, we did that at the state level, but it's about getting things done for people, saving lives and building the economy.
For those of us that observe the U.S. from outside, there were a lot of speculations around the elections to the Senate and to the House, but also on the different states. It didn't really go totally the way that was expected. Has there been like a change in the zeitgeist in the U.S.? Things goes a little bit up and down because it was very partisan. And then you saw some candidates that were less partisan, maybe did better than expected. And we know that this has gone in waves in the U.S. also in the past. Do you think things are changing in that respect, also in the run-up now?
It still feels very partisan to me, I must say. Even though, once again, we find ways to work together to get things done. And you saw that again over the last 2 years. But it is very hard. I mean, especially when you have people who deny reality, who are holding office. Literally people who are, believe in space lasers and, sort of have strange
We know
views.
about it.
And have very strange views about, about what we ought to be doing as a country. There still are people in the GOP caucus who are very pro-Russia. And I wonder about that in this day and age, in this moment. It's not being critical of all Republicans, but I just don't know where that stuff comes from other than QAnon, and I don't know.
Let me just say real quick, the American people basically, I think, are tired and very, very upset with how the operations are being going, whether it could be in extreme states or extreme Congress that we have. The problem that we have is the open press system and basically all the platforms. So if you're able to have 5 platforms, social platforms, that you can basically personify the extremes, somebody who is extremely right or extremely left, and it seems like that is the majority speaking. They're not the majority, but they're basically driving everybody to make a decision. What side are you on? Are you on this side or this side? And in America, there's only one side, the American side. It's not the Republican side or Democrat. We should be coming together to solve the problems from a different angle. But the problems are the same. But the bottom line is we don't. We try to basically put blame on, that's your problem, that's not mine, so it's your fault. That's not who we are. Our democracy will correct itself. The public and constituents will command that and demand it, that we correct it and come back to that sensible center.
So a short comment from Senator Sinema, and then I go to Senator Coons. Since last time we met, you become an independent.
That's correct.
Happened that same day or the day after, didn't it?
So, as folks know, I have formally declared my independence from what I consider to be a deeply broken two-party system. Those who know me know that I was always an independent voice and always have been for the things that I believe in and for my state and for my country. But I do think it's important to note that what you've heard about partisanship, I believe, is accurate. You know, in the last 2 years, if we think, you know, January 6th, which is a horrible day from 2 years ago, created, I think, concern and fear for every patriotic American across the country. But in the resulting 2 years, the Democratic Party shared a narrative that said we would not have any more free and fair elections in this country if the United States Congress didn't eliminate the filibuster and pass a massive voting rights package. As we all know, the filibuster was not eliminated. Joe and I were not interested in sacrificing that important guardrail for the institution. That massive voting rights bill was not passed through Congress. And then we had a free and fair election all across the country. And as has been noted, the outcome of that election was different than many people expected. Most election deniers lost across the country, and individuals of both political parties, some extreme, some moderate, won. So we had a free and fair election. So one could posit that the push by one political party to eliminate an important guardrail in an institution in our country may have been premature or overreaching in order to get the short-term victories they wanted. Then we fast forward to where we are today, and we saw the House of Representatives struggle for multiple days in a row as Kevin McCarthy, dear friend of mine, had to continue conceding point after point after point to the radical right of the GOP, to a point where he's now in an unenviable position that will make it very difficult for us to meet our obligation when the debt limit fight comes up later this year. Those are just two examples of the pull that you see political parties giving in order to get everything they want, rather than to recognize that the heart of a democracy is not just collaboration and working together, it is compromise. It is getting a lot done, but not everything you want done. And so I think that there's actually a really big opportunity right now for our country to have a reckoning of sorts and to see that perhaps these pulls that are happening in the parties, as Mikie mentioned, neither speaker has ever shown interest in recent years of collaborating with the moderates and other parties because they go on my way or the highway did. Pelosi did it. McCarthy's doing it. This is not healthy for democracy. So I think that this is an opportunity for us as a country to look back and say, is this partisanship serving us? I would posit to you that it's not. And so while some would say that there were reluctant folks working in Congress in the last 2 years, I would actually say that that was the basis for the productivity for some incredible achievements that made a difference for the American people in the last 2 years.
And we still don't agree on getting rid of the filibuster.
That's correct.
Thank you. I was thinking about Congresswoman Sherrill. I had only one question to you, and we know, and at least I know, you also have quite a distinguished background from the Army. I think you even have been a helicopter pilot for the U.S. Navy. And we did speak about Ukraine. We saw Afghanistan pull out. We have seen now that women and girls are not even admitted to universities or schools anymore. When you look at the U.S. Army with your background and also the challenges the U.S. is seeing from different parts of the world, do you think that the U.S. will continue to keep an army of the size you have today, because as I started to say, 45% of the global military capacity is from the US, or should Europe, for example, be ready to take a bigger share of this for ourselves?
I'm a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I don't think you're going to have anyone on the House Armed Services Committee suggest that Europe should not be taking on a larger share of the defense community. But Europe is. I think what we're seeing now, for the first time, really, for some countries, such as Germany, really getting heavily invested in the war for democracy and supporting Ukraine. We've actually seen, though, that's not just limited to Europe, what's going on around the world. I was just hearing from a gentleman from Japan about the recent diplomatic relationships and the military relationships going on and building up Japan's defense base, but also in concert with South Korea, longtime enemies, really. So we're seeing people coming together around the world in an understanding of how important it is with this global realignment that democracies come together to make sure that our defense is strong, really in order to provide deterrence against another Ukraine. And I just want to thank the Ukrainian people for their hard fight. I see Sasha in the audience, who's done such a wonderful job, a member of the Ukrainian parliament. We have had what I call shuttle diplomacy from members of the Ukrainian parliament talking to us all the time about what it's going to take for them to win this war. And the support from the United States in conjunction with our NATO allies has truly been astonishing, and I think really is a great scene setter for the future as we go forward together in supporting national security and deterrence.
Well, thank you so much, and I think it's significant what you underlined. When the third and fourth largest economy of the world, Japan and Germany, is deciding to go from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP to defense. That's a lot of defense. So I think the message is also received. Before I go to you, Senator Coons, we have to wrap up this thing. And I think people, at least I enjoyed it a lot. I learned also a lot. But what I learned from politics myself, you should end when people still want it to go on. And I think I look at the audience, I think we're still there. I just want one question to you, Governor Pritzker, because you also have such a distinguished business background. What we are looking at the US is, you know, inflation is starting to go down for the first time. We see there is still growth. The feeling, and what we hear here in Davos, is that the Fed was very late in increasing interest, and now they're very late in internalizing that inflation is on its way down. Is that something that you share?
Well, their aim is to bring it back down to 2%, as you know. But I have to say my expectation is that that will take a very long time, and that we can't rely on, you know, raising interest rates until that happens. That, if you want to see a massive recession, that's what it would result in.
But who can change that inflationary target then?
Well, what I'm suggesting to you is that there will be a reduction, a continuing reduction of inflation, but it's not going to head to 2% in the near future. But I do think we're going to have to live with a slightly elevated amount of inflation. Just, it's the nature of things. Look at the rest of the world. I mean, it's not that we're the only nation. In fact, we're probably at the lower end of most of the developed world anyway, in terms of inflation at this point. But I'm optimistic. I am. I think that the U.S. economy, if I don't know whether we'll get to a recession. I'm certainly hoping not, although we have to plan properly for that. But my expectation is that it will not be a deep recession if there is one, and that business is, though it may be moderating, we're not going to see a major dip, and we're not seeing massive job losses. In fact, there's still huge demand for labor, and that is, unfortunately, one of the things driving inflation.
I saw, Senator Coons, that you seem to agree, Governor Pritzker, on this. Yes. And But the inflationary target of 2% that is set as a target for the Fed is something that's politically decided. I guess the Senate or the House could change that to 3% or 2.5. You know, China is not exporting deflation anymore, so.
I do agree that I'm optimistic that if we have a recession, it will be relatively light. The independence of our Fed is a key part of our economic system, and they have, over many years, managed our economy and our banking system and our money supply relatively well. I do think that one of the things that continues to make the American economy strong and robust is innovation. Our commitment to being a free and open society and economy, one that welcomes people of talent and people in need of asylum from around the world, but frankly also our global network of alliances, those countries that closely share our values, that have been our partners for decades. I think one of the strongest things that President Biden has done in response to the aggression of Russia in Ukraine is to work closely with our allies around the world, not just in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific. And I think in the coming 2 years, we'll see even more progress. As you mentioned, Børge, both Japan and Germany are significantly strengthening their share of the defense burden. I also think Chancellor Scholz had called for a climate club, and we will begin to see some positive movement in that direction. If the United States can learn some lessons from Switzerland, from Germany, about workforce training and skills development, and we can find a way to move past some of the disagreements over the moment that are resulting from our current climate ambition, I think our partnership, our alliances will be stronger than ever, and I think we have a very bright future together.
Well, thank you so much. I'm after listening to this panel, we see there is so much competence in the U.S. Government. It's been a pleasure to listen to you. You see, it's late in Davos. This slot at 6 o'clock is a tough slot, but you made it. You see, people are still here. They're getting late to their dinners, but I think we're all so interested in where America is heading. And thank you so much to the panel. They deserve a big applause. Thank you so much.